The audience had come expecting jokes. They expected smiles, quick banter, a few well-timed laughs that would make the evening feel light, familiar, safe. They expected Prince Harry to sit across from Jon Stewart, talk about his book, offer a few self-deprecating remarks about royal life, maybe poke fun at himself, and leave to warm applause. That was the rhythm of The Daily Show. That was the unspoken contract. What they didn't expect was silence, because sometimes the most uncomfortable moments don't begin with shouting or confrontation. They begin with a question that sounds polite, almost friendly, and lands like a trap you don't realize you've stepped into until it tightens. Tonight, Prince Harry would realize something too late. Jon Stewart wasn't there to argue with him. He was there to understand him, and that, it turned out, was far more dangerous. The studio lights glowed softly against the deep blue backdrop of The Daily Show. Behind them, the illuminated digital world map pulsed faintly, a quiet reminder of a planet constantly watching, constantly reacting, constantly judging. The familiar desk stood between host and guest like a neutral border wood polished. Unthreatening, ceremonial, Prince Harry sat upright in his chair, jacket neatly buttoned, shoulders squared. He looked calm, confident, almost relieved. This wasn't hostile territory. Late-night television had always felt safer than primetime interviews or investigative sit-downs. There were rules here, rhythm, humor as insulation. Across from him, Jon Stewart leaned slightly forward, hands resting loosely near his mug. His expression was neutral, attentive, not confrontational. It was the kind of look that made guests feel safe at least at first. Not aggressive, not skeptical, curious. The audience applauded as Jon turned toward the camera. "Welcome back," Jon said with his familiar warmth. "My guest tonight is Prince Harry." The applause came again, polite, curious, respectful. No whooping, no boos, just measured enthusiasm. Harry nodded once, lips forming a practiced smile. He'd done this dozens of times. Interviews were familiar terrain. He knew how to control a room, how to guide a conversation, how to soften edges when needed. Jon picked up his mug, took a small sip, then turned back to Harry. "First of all," Jon began casually, "thank you for being here." Harry inclined his head. "Thank you for having me." "So," Jon continued, "you've been busy. Book tours, interviews, conversations about identity, trauma, family, media." He smiled slightly. "A lot of conversations." Harry let out a soft chuckle. "That's one way to put it." The audience laughed lightly, right on cue. The rhythm was intact. So far, so good. Jon nodded, then set his mug down. "I want to start simple." Harry shifted slightly in his seat, attentive but relaxed. "When you decided to write your book," Jon asked, "what was the goal? What did you want people to understand?" Harry didn't hesitate. He'd rehearsed this answer countless times. It came out smoothly, confidently. "I wanted to tell my truth," he said. "For years, others told it for me, the media, the institution, people who didn't live my life. I wanted to finally speak for myself." Jon listened carefully, eyes steady, no interruption, no eyebrow raises, no smirk. "That makes sense," Jon said, "taking control of your own narrative." "Yes," Harry replied quickly, nodding. "Exactly." There was a beat, a quiet one. It's not awkward, but deliberate. Jon leaned back slightly, considering. "When you say control," he said, "what does that mean to you?" Harry blinked once, not startled, just recalibrating. "It means correcting falsehoods, filling in gaps, providing context that was missing." Jon nodded. "Context is powerful." Harry smiled. "It is." "And," Jon added gently, "once a narrative is out there, especially one this personal, it doesn't just belong to the person telling it anymore, does it?" The smile on Harry's face tightened slightly. "Just a fraction. Barely visible, well," he said, choosing his words. "People will always interpret things their own way, but at least now they have my voice, not just speculation." Jon's gaze remained steady. "Do you feel heard?" Harry paused. A short pause, but long enough to register. "I think," he said carefully, "there's a difference between being heard and being understood. A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Jon nodded slowly. "That's true," he said. "Do you think repetition helps understanding or complicates it?" Harry's posture stiffened just a touch. "I think repetition is sometimes necessary when people refuse to listen the first time." Jon smiled faintly, not disagreeing, not agreeing either, or he offered, "When the story keeps evolving." The room didn't react loudly. No gasps, no laughter. Just a subtle shift in energy like air pressure changing before a storm. Harry's expression remained composed, but his shoulders squared again, instinctively. "My story hasn't changed," he said. "I've just told more of it." Jon tilted, his head slightly, and with more detail comes more scrutiny. Harry exhaled through his nose. "That's the cost of honesty." "Is it?" Jon asked softly. The question didn't sound accusatory. It sounded curious, almost empathetic. Harry nodded. "Yes." Jon waited. Let the silence stretch just long enough to be felt. "Can honesty," Jon asked, "exist without responsibility for how it lands?" Harry's jaw tightened briefly. "I'm responsible for telling the truth, not for how institutions or audiences react to it." Jon absorbed that, even when the story carries power. Harry frowned slightly. "What kind of power?" "Kind that shapes perception," Jon said. "Reputation, legacy, belief." Harry leaned back a fraction. "I didn't ask for that power." "No," Jon agreed. "But you have it." The audience shifted in their seats. No one laughed this time. Harry smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you're giving me more credit than I deserve." Jon's voice stayed calm. "I think you underestimate how much influence comes with vulnerability." Another pause. Longer now. Harry glanced briefly toward the audience, then back to Jon. "I shared my story to heal." And Jon asked, "Has it healed you?" Harry opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, he didn't answer immediately. The studio felt quieter than before. The laughter had drained away, replaced by something heavier, more focused. Jon didn't rush him. He never did. When Harry finally spoke, his voice was steady but more guarded. "Healing isn't a destination. It's a process." Jon nodded. "And processes invite questions." Harry's smile faded slightly. That was when he realized it. Jon Stewart wasn't trying to corner him. He wasn't trying to challenge him. He wasn't even trying to expose him. He was listening, and in that quiet, attentive listening, without jokes, without confrontation, without escape prints, Harry felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not attack, reflection. And sometimes, reflection is the hardest thing to face on live television. "Exactly," Jon said, leaning back slightly in his chair. "And did you expect the reaction to be this intense?" Harry smiled again, but this time the smile didn't quite settle. It held for a second too long, tight at the edges, as if it were doing work instead of expressing ease. "I think people project a lot onto me," he said. "I'm used to it. There's always been anger, judgment, assumptions." The audience murmured softly, not in disagreement, not in approval, just recognition. Jon nodded slowly. "Right. Because you're not just a person. You're a symbol." Harry's eyebrows lifted. "It's part of the problem." Jon raised a hand gently, a calming gesture. "We'll get there." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, easing the moment just enough. Jon glanced down at the book resting on the desk in front of him, his fingers resting lightly on the cover, but he didn't open it. He didn't quote from it. He let it sit there, present but unused. "You've spoken a lot," Jon said, "about the pressure of growing up in the public eye, about not having a normal childhood." Harry's posture shifted slightly. This was familiar ground. He had walked this path many times before. "I didn't have the freedom most kids have," Harry said. Every mistake became a headline. Every emotion became entertainment. Jon nodded. "That's real," Harry exhaled, relieved by the affirmation. "And that kind of scrutiny," Jon continued, "can break people." "Exactly," Harry said. There was a pause, not awkward, intentional. Jon looked up from the desk, his expression thoughtful. "But here's something I've been thinking about." Harry waited. You talk about the media as this relentless force, Jon said. And you're not wrong. But you're also incredibly present in it. A small ripple of laughter passed through the audience, surprised but not mocking. Harry's smile flickered. Jon continued smoothly, his tone unchanged. Interviews, podcasts, documentaries, books. You criticize the system while using it very effectively. Harry shifted in his chair. That's because I'm trying to change it from within, he said. You can't dismantle something. By staying silent, Jon nodded. Fair point. The room relaxed. Harry relaxed too. Jon smiled slightly. See, we're agreeing already. The audience laughed more openly this time. Harry chuckled along, though his eyes didn't fully soften. Jon leaned forward a little. Let me ask you something else. Harry nodded. When people criticize you, not the tabloids, but regular people, what do you think they misunderstand? Most? Harry didn't answer immediately. The question lingered, inviting something more reflective. I think they don't see the human cost, he said finally. They see privilege, not pain. Jon's gaze stayed fixed on him. Do you think he asked carefully that sometimes they see both? The laughter stopped. Harry's jaw tightened. Just a fraction. I think empathy is lacking, Harry said, especially when it comes to mental health. Jon nodded, but he didn't smile this time. Mental health is serious, he said, and it deserves respect. Harry leaned forward slightly, encouraged, but Jon added calmly, people also struggle when someone who had immense protection, wealth, and opportunity speaks as if suffering erases all of that. A few audience members shifted in their seats. Harry's expression hardened. I've never said privilege cancels pain, he replied sharply. Jon raised his hands gently. I'm not saying you did. I'm saying that's how it can sound. Harry opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, there was a noticeable pause, long enough for the cameras to catch, long enough for the audience to feel. Jon glanced briefly at the audience, then back to Harry. We'll take a quick break, he said smoothly. When we come back, I want to talk about responsibility. The word lingered in the air longer than the others had. Harry leaned back in his chair as the lights dimmed, his eyes narrowing slightly. For the first time that night, he wasn't smiling. The applause after the commercial break was thinner, not hostile, not yet, just cautious. Prince Harry sat, a little farther back in his chair now. His hands were clasped together, fingers interlocked tightly enough that his knuckles had gone pale. He kept his eyes fixed on Jon Stewart as the lights brightened again. Jon didn't rush. He let the silence breathe, let the audience settle into the shift they could feel but hadn't fully named. Welcome back, Jon said calmly. I'm still here with Prince Harry. A polite ripple of applause passed through the studio. Jon turned slightly toward Harry, his voice steady, almost gentle. Before the break, he said, we were talking about empathy and responsibility. Harry nodded once. When someone shares their story publicly, Jon continued, especially a painful one, it creates connection. But it also creates influence. Harry's grip tightened. Do you believe, Jon asked, that influence carries responsibility? Harry's eyes flickered, searching for the right framing. I believe people are responsible for how they tell their story, he said, not for how others twist it. Jon nodded. And when the interpretation isn't twisting? Harry hesitated. That's different, he said. But questions can still harm. Agreed, Jon said. So can silence. The studio was quiet now. No laughter, no murmurs. Jon leaned back slightly. I'm not asking you to apologize. For your pain, he said. I'm asking whether you think there's space for complexity where pain, privilege, responsibility, and empathy all exist at the same time. Harry looked at him, really looked at him now. That's a hard space to occupy, Harry said. Yes, Jon replied. But it might be the most honest one. Harry inhaled slowly, exhaled through his nose. For the first time that night, he didn't look like a guest performing a role. He looked like someone realizing that understanding real. Understanding was far more demanding than applause, and the audience felt it too. Before the break, Jon said calmly, we were talking about responsibility. Harry nodded once. Yes. Jon leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. The posture wasn't aggressive, but it was deliberate, closer, more grounded. As if the conversation had crossed a threshold where distance no longer helped. You've spoken a lot, Jon continued, about accountability from institutions, from the press, from your family, and that's fair. Power structures should be questioned. Harry's chin lifted slightly, a reflexive gesture of agreement. Exactly, but accountability. Jon went on, his voice steady, is uncomfortable because it's symmetrical. It doesn't just go one way. Harry's eyes narrowed, just a fraction. What do you mean? Jon reached for the book at last. He didn't open it, didn't flip through pages or search for a quote. He simply placed his palm flat on the cover, grounding the object in the conversation without weaponizing it. You've made deeply personal stories public, Jon said. Stories about your family, about your brother, about your father, about your childhood. Harry straightened immediately, his spine stiffening. They were already public, he said quickly. I didn't create that exposure. Jon nodded. You didn't create it, he agreed. But you expanded it. The audience went quiet. Not even a cough. Harry exhaled sharply through his nose. I told my truth. Jon tilted his head slightly. Your truth, he said carefully, or the truth? The question landed harder than any joke could have. There was no laughter to soften it, no music cue, just the words suspended. Harry's lips pressed into a thin line. There isn't just one truth, he said. There are lived experiences. Of course, Jon replied. But lived experiences intersect with other people's lives, especially when those people don't get to respond. A murmur spread through the audience, low and uneasy. Harry leaned forward now, his voice firmer. They had decades to respond. To listen? Jon didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He waited. Let me ask this differently, Jon said after a beat. When you talk about privacy, about how damaging exposure can be, do you see the contradiction? Harry's jaw tightened. I see survival, he said. I see someone who had to speak before being destroyed by silence. Jon nodded slowly. And do you think your brother would describe your silence the same way? The studio froze. Harry blinked once. Twice. That's not fair, he said sharply. Jon's voice remained even. It's a real question. Harry's shoulders tensed, rising slightly as if bracing against an unseen weight. For years, Harry said, his words coming faster now, I protected that family. I stayed quiet, but I'd absorbed the damage, and it nearly broke me. I had to leave. That, Jon said. But when I finally speak, Harry continued, I'm told I'm responsible for everyone else's feelings, for their reputations, for their discomfort. Jon didn't look away. Not responsible for their feelings. He said, responsible for your impact. There it was again. That word? Harry shook his head. Impact without context is distortion. In context without restraint, Jon replied, can be collateral. The audience shifted, collectively sensing the narrowing space between the two men, not hostility, but friction. You talk about generational trauma, Jon went on, about cycles that repeat unless someone breaks them. Yes, Harry said, and breaking cycles sometimes means choosing what not to say, Jon added. Not because it isn't true, but because truth isn't the only ethical consideration. Harry laughed once, short and humorless. So I should have stayed silent. I didn't say that, Jon said. I'm asking whether there was a middle ground between silence and exposure. Harry looked down at the desk briefly, then back up. When you've lived inside a system that erases you, he said, middle ground doesn't feel safe. Jon nodded. That makes sense. Safety for one person, Jon continued, can feel like betrayal to another. Harry's expression tightened. You're asking me to carry everyone else's burden? No, Jon said. I'm asking whether you recognize that you placed some of it on them. The room was silent again. Harry inhaled deeply, then exhaled. I didn't write the book to hurt anyone, he said. I wrote it so my children would understand why I did what I did. Jon softened slightly at that. And that's human, he said. But children also learn from how we talk about others, especially those closest to us. Harry's eyes flickered. You've asked the world for empathy, Jon said. Do you believe empathy includes people who don't share your microphone? Harry didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. Believe empathy includes understanding why someone speaks. Jon nodded. And understanding why someone stays silent? The two men held each other's gaze. This isn't about catching you in a contradiction, Jon said. It's about the tension between truth and responsibility, and whether there's space to hold both without turning family into evidence.
Harry
leaned back slowly, his shoulders still tight. For the first time since the interview began, he looked less like someone defending a position, more like someone confronting a cost he hadn't fully named. The audience remained still. No applause. No boos. You're asking me to speak for him now? Harry said, his voice sharp with disbelief. I'm asking you, Jon replied evenly, whether you ever paused and thought. What happens to the people I leave behind when I tell my story this way? For the first time that night, Harry looked away. It was subtle, just a turn of the head. Break in eye contact, but the camera caught it. The audience caught it. The moment stretched longer than it should have, long enough to feel intentional. Long enough to feel revealing. Harry turned back, his eyes flashing. You're framing this like I acted recklessly. Jon shook his head slightly. No, he said. I'm framing it like actions have gravity. Harry let out a short, humorless laugh. Easy to say from a desk. Few gasps rippled through the crowd. Not outrage-recognition. Jon raised his eyebrows. Not offended. Intrigued. You're right, he said. It is easy to ask questions from a desk. Harry leaned in now, his voice edged with frustration. You don't know what it's like to be born into something you can't escape. Jon met his gaze without hesitation. No, he said. But I do know what it's like to be judged for choices you can make. Silence, the kind that presses against the chest. Harry shifted in his seat, the movement restless. Leaving was my choice, he said finally. Jon nodded. Yes. Telling everything, Jon added gently, was also your choice. Harry's mouth opened, then closed. For a brief moment, the practiced composure slipped. He looked less like a prince, less like a symbol, and more like someone realizing his own argument had narrowed the room around him. You're implying I did this for attention, Harry said coldly. Jon shook his head. I'm implying that intention doesn't cancel impact. The audience murmured again, louder this time. Not agreement, not condemnation. Processing, Harry leaned back abruptly, crossing his arms. This feels less like a conversation and more like a prosecution. Jon smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. I don't need to prosecute, he said. Public reaction does that on its own, Harry scoffed. Public reaction is fueled by misunderstanding. Jon said quietly. You keep feeding it. That was the moment Harry's composure cracked. Not explosively, not theatrically, but visibly. His breathing changed. Shallower, faster. His fingers unclasped, then clenched again, as if his hands no longer knew what to do without a script. So what do you want from me? Harry snapped. An apology, silence, regret. Jon looked at him steadily. Perspective, the word, hung between them, weighty and unadorned. Harry shook his head. You're sitting here dissecting my life like it's a case study. Jon nodded once, because you presented it like one. Harry's eyes narrowed. I presented it like testimony. And testimony, Jon replied, invites examination. The audience shifted again. No one laughed. No one applauded. Room felt suspended. As if the interview had stopped being entertainment and become something closer to a reckoning. You talk about healing, Jon continued. About moving forward. But healing isn't just expression. It's integration. asking how your truth lives alongside other people's realities. They had their chance, Harry said. They had platforms, power, protection. And now, Jon said softly, so do you. Harry inhaled sharply. So I'm not allowed to use it. I didn't say that, Jon replied. I'm asking whether using it comes with obligations you don't want to name. Harry's jaw tightened. You're asking for restraint from someone who has never given any. Jon nodded slowly. That's often how cycles repeat. Harry stared at him, his expression caught between anger and something closer to fatigue. 4 years, Harry said, his voice lower now. I was told to endure, to keep my head down, to absorb it all quietly. I believe you, Jon said. And now, Harry continued, when I finally speak, I'm told I spoke too loudly, too much, too honestly. Jon held his gaze. Sometimes honesty without boundaries becomes another form of force. The words landed heavily. Harry leaned back again, rubbing his hands together, grounding himself. So what's the solution? He asked. To rewrite my life until it's palatable. No, Jon said. To acknowledge that telling your story doesn't exempt you from the consequences of how it's told. The lights above them hummed softly. The audience remained silent, not out of politeness, but because no one wanted to break the tension. You don't sound angry? Harry said suddenly. I'm not, Jon replied. Then what are you? Concerned, Jon said. 'Cause I think you're confusing being heard with being vindicated. Harry swallowed. For the first time tonight, Jon continued. It feels like you're defending the story instead of reflecting on it. Harry looked down at the desk, then back up. Maybe reflection comes later, he said. Jon nodded. That's fair. A beat. But later, Jon added, is still coming. The camera pulled back slightly. The desk felt wider now, the space between them heavier. Harry sat quietly, his arms uncrossed, his hands resting flat in front of him. He didn't look defeated. He didn't look victorious. He looked like someone who had just realized that telling the truth was only the beginning and that what followed. This might be harder than silence ever was. The audience didn't applaud. They waited. And for the first time that night, so did Prince Harry.